Alexander the Great, this famous Macedonian commander from the 4th century BC. We all know Alexander the Great, tutored by Aristotle, becomes a king at age 20, conquers this enormous stretch of territory from Greece to India, retires with an undefeated record in battle, regarded as one of the most skilled military commanders in all of human history. His tactics still taught today at places like West Point and other military academies around the world. How do we know all of this about Alexander the Great? Well, because of ancient writings. There's the Campaigns of Alexander, a history written in the 2nd century AD. And then there's an entry in the Library of World History, published in the 1st century AD, that recounts Alexander's life. That's the oldest surviving material on Alexander. Everything else is just a rehash of those works and only exists in tiny fragments or maybe an inscription on an ancient building, or has been lost to history entirely. The best surviving evidence we have for Alexander the Great comes from just 5 sources, none of whom knew Alexander personally, but lived 300, 400, 500 years after his death. And yet, it doesn't matter when or where you went to school, no history books are going to ever doubt that Alexander existed. His mark on history is just too important, too undeniable, which makes me so excited to tell you about Jesus. Now, what does all this scant historical evidence about Alexander the Great have to do with Jesus? Well, because, because compared to other people from the ancient world, the evidence we have for the real deal Jesus is remarkably robust. We have writings, not just from centuries after his life, but written from the century he was alive, written by the people who actually knew him, who followed him, who heard what he had to say, who saw firsthand his miracles, and most importantly, his death and his resurrection. Whereas there are only a handful of ancient documents that teach us about the greatness of Alexander, we have more than 5,000 copies of the Greek New Testament, all testifying to the person of Jesus Christ, who was really born in Bethlehem, really grew up in Nazareth, really preached in Galilee, really died in Jerusalem, really had a family, really ate and drank, really had feelings, and really rose again. And that's just in the Bible. Now, I can understand if that leaves some people skeptical. The Bible's the only source I need, but some people would argue, okay, all your evidence for Jesus comes from the Bible. Isn't that a biased source? Well, can I take the Bible's word for it? I can, and I hope you can too. But there's more. We have correspondence from his earliest followers, that first generation of Christians, letters from disciples that don't appear in the Bible, diaries from the early Christian church, people with names like Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp and Justin the martyr. And beyond that, beyond Christian communities who would write about the Jesus they knew, loved, and shared, we have evidence of Jesus from non-biblical sources, from the historians of the day, from those people who were writing the news, the accounts of what was happening in the world. And it's funny because some of the most reliable non-biblical sources we have are from the people who disliked Jesus and Christianity the most, like the Jewish historian Josephus, who writes about a Jesus who was called Christ, who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. This is in an era, the early Christian church grew up under intense Jewish persecution for seeming that they were splitting off and trying something new. And then there's the Romans, those who had crucified Jesus would also chase down those earliest Christians. And yet we have evidence from a Roman named Tacitus, who writes about Jesus in his diaries, or a governor named Pliny, who was writing back to his emperor Trajan about these Christians who would do the strangest things, like get together once a week. They would have dinner in their homes of what looks like ordinary food, he'd write. It's not a feast, it's just bread and wine. and that they would read together, they would pray together, they would even promise to one another, make vows that they wouldn't do things like steal from each other, or they wouldn't hurt one another. Strange things. And he said, and after it's all done, they sang about Christ as if he were a god. Even today, scholars and skeptics who look into this sort of thing are met with mountains of undeniable evidence that Jesus was a very real man, even if they have questions whether he was very, really God. More on that in just a bit.